And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, "Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you, and hem you in on every side, and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will leave not one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation." These were the words of Christ Jesus from Luke chapter 19. Following his triumphal entry into Jerusalem and prior to his cleansing of the temple, here he foretold of the city's destruction, and he signified an unclean house. As the law of Moses instructed, we read in Leviticus chapter 14, that houses which were infected with leprosy and had persisted after washing ought to be taken apart piece by piece. So, welcome back to Church History 1, our series on the first 500 years of church history, the age of the early church fathers. In today's lesson, we're going to look at how the city of Jerusalem was destroyed in the late first century and what happened afterwards. But first, let's review what we covered last lesson. Last week, we saw how the church began as a small number of disciples in Jerusalem, and that thousands were added to their number following Pentecost. We saw how the Hellenists and the Hebrews settled disputes among themselves, and how the Hellenistic Christians were scattered out of Judea to establish churches throughout the world. We saw that Christians were beginning to be recognized as a group apart from Judaism. We left off just after the persecution of the Christians in Rome. This must have been a time of immense fear and discouragement for the Christians. Not only were many from their number being taken and killed by the authorities, but so were the apostles, including Peter, Paul, and James the Just. In the following lesson and beyond, we'll be covering a number of topics which involve suffering and death. So I admit that these are difficult subjects to parse, and they test us as Christians, but let me encourage you to consider the greater narrative that these events are a part of. The redemptive arc of history is that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. We read this in Genesis 3:15. Notice the power of God in the death of Christ, that he was defeating his enemies even as they believed they had defeated him. Paul wrote in the book of Colossians, that, quote, "He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. The same is true for the followers of Christ when they are persecuted." So keep that in mind. All right. In the last lesson, a number of you asked some very diligent questions regarding the finer details of traditional Roman religion. After the fact, I was not altogether happy with how I answered some of these questions, so I wanted to quickly outline a few things to think about regarding Roman religion, and this will lead us into the Jewish revolt. This will be a good preface to the Jewish revolt. It is apparent in the Roman sources that the Romans contrasted what they called religio versus superstitio. So the Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote that religio honors the gods, whereas superstitio wrongs them. To the Romans, superstition was exemplified by a number of different characteristics, such as the use of magic, any sort of excessive devotion. So this could be a number of different things. This could be like chanting. They saw maybe some of the sacraments that Christians were practicing as examples of excessive devotion. They saw circumcision and some of the ceremonies of the Jews this way. A lack of self-control, and even a striving for secret knowledge. They saw this as superstition. These were seen as going against the grain of traditional Roman religion. Many religious disciplines from the East were viewed in this light, including Judaism and Christianity. Now, ironically, after Christianity takes hold in the Roman Empire, this outlook flips to pagans. When Rome is Christianized, all of pagan religion will be viewed as superstition. So this sort of outlook, there's a little bit of continuity into Christendom, which is interesting to think about. But overall, I think we can think about this in terms of worldview. This is people of different worldviews looking at other people. We might think of this, the pagan Romans talking about the pagan, maybe Persians or Jews or Christians, or not the pagan Christians, but looking at them and thinking they're superstitious. It's kind of like the pot calling the kettle black, pagans calling pagans superstitious. So, all right. So it was this sort of antipathy toward the East, along with many other factors, that may have inspired the Roman Imperium to reach out and take possession of Palestine in the first century. Which that brings us to the First Jewish and Roman War. In the years that followed Christ's ascension, Palestine descended increasingly into a state of anarchy and lawlessness. Various factions hardened their resolve. The Christians were a part of this, by the way. They're a very important part of this. The various factions hardened their resolve, especially the Zealots. The Zealots relentlessly stoked violence and rebellious fervor in and around Jerusalem. And in the countryside, we see the sources talk about men raising their own personal armies of bandits and starting to take plunder from their neighbors. To add to this, the successive Roman governors, from Pontius Pilate to Gessius Florus, continued a long process of indiscretion. So they erred in a number of different ways, provoking the Jews. Everything from appropriating funds for public works from the temple treasury to brutally suppressing any Jewish dissent. In addition to this, there were also historical accounts of miraculous signs and omens in which the factions interpreted these signs to suit their own ends. So I wanted to read this excerpt from Tacitus. This is a kind of long excerpt, but I thought it was important enough to read because, one, it shows Tacitus briefly describes a few of these signs and omens, and it also shows the Roman outlook towards this entire situation. So Tacitus writes, "Prodigies had occurred, which this nation, prone to superstition, but hating all religious rites, did not deem it lawful to expiate by offering and sacrifices." Talking about the Jews here. There had been seen hosts joining battle in the skies, the fiery gleam of arms, the temple illuminated by a sudden radiance from the clouds. The doors of the inner shrine were suddenly thrown open, and a voice of more than mortal tone was heard to cry that the gods were departing. At the same time, there was a mighty stir as of departure. Some few put a fearful meaning on these events, but in most, there was a firm persuasion that in the ancient records of their priests was contained a prediction of how, at this very time, the East was to grow powerful, and rulers coming from Judea were to acquire universal empire. These mysterious prophecies had pointed to Vespasian and Titus, but the common people, with the usual blindness of ambition, had interpreted these mighty destinies of themselves and could not be brought, even by disasters, to believe the truth. So we see how these omens and signs were putting gasoline on the fire in Palestine at the time. The final provocation occurred in May of 66 AD when Herod Agrippa and his sister Berenice, that's the grandson of Herod the Great, traveled to Jerusalem to quell an uprising. They were eventually expelled from Jerusalem by the mob. The temple priests then ordered a prohibition of offerings from the Gentiles in the temple. So they prohibited Gentiles from going into the temple and offering sacrifice upon penalty of death. They ordered that loyalty offerings to the Roman emperor would cease. So they're actually giving loyalty offerings in the temple to the Roman emperor, and they chose to cut this off, which is definitively saying that we want independence from Rome. Yes, Dan?
I thought that even from the tabernacle, Gentiles were not allowed to go within the court and then the temple in court.
Right. Right. Yeah, I believe that. Yeah, I believe you're right. I'm not too knowledgeable about Levitical laws regarding the tabernacle and Gentiles. I believe there is some sort of a change with temple worship. I don't know if anybody can help me out with that, but I do believe that Gentiles could worship in Jerusalem. They could bring offerings. That was a part of the law. Does anybody? In the outer court? Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Yeah, I think that things had come to such a fever point that I don't think Gentiles were allowed into the temple complex itself, which was a huge complex. I'm not sure exactly how big it was, but yeah. So at this point, the Roman Imperium ran out of patience with the Jewish authorities in Palestine, and they sought to take the entire province as a possession of their own. Emperor Nero commissioned a military campaign which began that same year. What followed was the most pivotal series of events in the history of the first century. The campaign was prosecuted over 8 years in 3 different phases by 3 different generals. The first general, Cestius Gallus, reached Jerusalem, but he was unprepared to take it by force. Gallus's legions were repelled by the combined forces of the Jews, which made up for in tenacity what they lacked in discipline. Next, the prominent and experienced General Vespasian was appointed to the task. With his 3 legions working southward city by city through Galilee, Samaria, and Judea, in June of 68, Nero had to flee Rome and committed suicide. This led to a war of succession known as the Year of 4 Emperors. So at this point, Rome is cast into their own internal conflicts. General Vespasian was declared and confirmed as emperor by December in the year 69. His son Titus resumed the campaign in Judea that same month. By March, Titus was camped north of Jerusalem, from which he unleashed a brutal 5-month-long siege. So they have a stranglehold on the city of Jerusalem. The threat of Roman legions outside the city walls seemed to quell the unrest within Jerusalem. So these different fighting factions, when they see armies outside of the city, they decide, look, there's a bigger threat. Let's direct our attention that way. And after Titus's legions breached Jerusalem, the Jewish combatants fall back into the actual temple complex and use it as a fortress. In August, the Roman soldiers breached the outer wall of the temple complex, so they reach inside the temple. 2 days later, the temple itself was set ablaze. They're not really sure how this happened, but the temple was set on fire. It was recorded in the histories that the Roman soldiers abandoned all discipline and an indiscriminate slaughter ensued. Eventually, the temple was completely looted and the Temple Mount was razed. Every stone was dismantled. Jerusalem was completely destroyed in the year 70 AD. Josephus, the Jewish historian, and he was really a Jewish aristocrat almost, or a general at this time. Josephus recorded that Vespasian, that's the Roman general, he ordered that the entire city be demolished except for 3 towers and a fortification wall on the west side of the city. Of the fortification wall, Josephus wrote that there was nothing left to make, that there was nothing to make those that came thither believe that it had ever been inhabited. Thus the region of Palestine would be colonized by Rome. The ruins of Jerusalem would later be converted into a Roman fort. Josephus estimated that over the years, 1.1 million Jews were killed in the fighting, and around 97,000 were taken captive. Those taken captive were either sold into slavery or put to death for sport in the various Roman arenas. But the Jewish war would not be finished until the fall of Masada, which was this fortress in further south in Judea, and that took place in 74 AD. All right. It is important to remember that the Christians in Palestine did not take part in the revolt. Rather, they were obedient to the words of their Savior, Jesus Christ. We read in Luke chapter 21, Jesus in the Olivet Discourse instructs them, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. For these are days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. Alas for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days, for there will be great distress upon the earth, and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations. Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." The Christians left Judea before the fighting had begun, and they fled to a town called Pella, which is actually quite far away. It's in northern Perea. And interestingly, Nicholas Needham puts this interesting note. He says that Pella was close to the brook of Cherith, where Elijah sought refuge from King Ahab. So here I have a couple of intriguing slides. This is after the conquest of Judea. There was a Roman triumph in Rome when Titus comes back. A triumph was a ritual procession through the city to celebrate a general's victory. And they erected this arch in honor of Titus. One of the relief on the arches you can see depicts the Roman legionaries looting the temple of its content. You can see the lampstand, the table of showbread, and the sacred trumpets. I'm not sure what these are. I think they might just be Roman standards. Yes.
When the temple was dismantled, not one stone left on the other, you know the story behind why that took place?
I've heard different things. I've heard something about how the mortar was made with gold. Yeah.
And melted and it went between the cracks.
Right.
And so that to get the gold, they moved these huge stones.
Yeah. So Dan points out that there's historical record that the mortar of the temple is made with gold. So part of the dismantling of the temple was to loot the gold from the actual construction of the temple. This is a commemorative coin for the conquest of Judea, and it depicts on the face of it, this is Vespasian, and on the other side of it we have a symbol of Judea, the palm tree. This is a Jewish captive in bonds, and on the other side of the tree is a Jewish woman in mourning. So, interesting historical artifact in how they brought the people who they conquered through a humiliation ritual. Very terrible. But it's good to look at these artifacts because they really bring to life that this was an actual event that took place. We have a few consequences of the war to take note of. The war accelerated Christianity's appeal to the world of the Gentiles because the home of Christendom and Judaism had been destroyed. Number two, the Christian flight to Pella solidified the growing barrier between Christians and the Jewish people. So there's this growing this growing animus between Jews and Christians, and it's really solidified after 70 AD. The Pharisees became the primary religious leaders in Judaism. The Zealots were destroyed. The Essenes were wiped out. And the destruction of the temple meant that the Sadducees no longer had a base of power in the region. So the Pharisees are the only ones left. After the war, the Pharisees reestablished the Sanhedrin in the city of Jamnia. At the Council of Jamnia, the Pharisees deemed that Jewish Christians would be denied any fellowship with Jews in the synagogue, and they placed a curse on all Christians in the Jewish liturgy. All right, so we no longer have community going on between Christians and Jews in the synagogue. Yes?
So when the Jews returned from Babylon, there was only a segment, there was actually a minority of Jews
Yes.
that had come back from Babylon. So there's still a great deal of Judaism outside of Judea
Yes.
and Jerusalem. Does that factor into any of the setting up of synagogues after the Jewish wars? Did they factor into it at all? Or are they just out there doing their own thing? Or did you
Yeah, I haven't done.
address that at all?
Right. Yeah, I haven't done that study. No. I do think that one thing that I can think of is that it's important to remember that Babylon is really not really a.
It's a backwater at this point.
It's a backwater. Yes, the city has been diminished far from its former glory. So there's probably a small colony of Jews there. The rest are dispersed throughout the Parthian and Roman Empire. So the main base of power is Jerusalem and Judea. So that's where the resources are coming from. So it's important to remember that, I suppose. The mid-1st century marked a period of transition. Hold on, need to switch. Okay. A period of transition for the early Christians because these years were tumultuous. The Christians were focused on preaching, teaching, and establishing churches, and they were not so concerned with writing or developing theology. This would change as the 2nd century dawned. The Christians would encounter even more persecution from the state. So it's a very dark time for the Christians. It's about to get darker before it gets better. The Christians would encounter even more persecution from the state, and the leadership of the church would have to mature with the passing on of the apostles. I can't imagine how it must have been to be a pastor at this time. The apostles are dying out, they're a dying generation, and the place where the Holy Land is being colonized by the Romans, and we're also being hunted down by various Romans in the provinces. So it's a very discouraging time. Those men who had been taught personally by the Savior Jesus Christ, so those are the apostles, the church's resolve would harden, and they would become invested in presenting the message of the gospel to the reprobate world around them. All right? So we're going to move into lesson 3. And in lesson 3, we're going to cover, this is the Apostolic Fathers. We're going to look at some of their writings. We're going to investigate some figments of church organization during the 2nd century. We're going to look at persecution, apologetics, and some early heresies. That's our goal with this lesson. The period directly after the death of the apostles is known as the age of the Apostolic Fathers. So roughly that's from about 95 AD to about 140 AD, but some people have different opinions about it. What does Apostolic Fathers mean? Put simply, the Apostolic Fathers are just the first generation of the early church fathers. So it's a generation of pastors that took the baton from the apostles, that were either taught personally by them or were connected to them indirectly somehow. It's not to be confused with what people call the early church fathers, which those would cover about the first 500 years of church history. We usually call those the early church fathers. So, like, for example, Augustine, he is in the 5th century, and they still call him an early church father. This is also called the patristic age as well. That's a common name in history for that. All right, so the following is a list of important writings from the Apostolic Fathers. It's important to keep in mind there are many more writings. I had to do some triage and look at some important ones, but I'm going to focus on 4 in particular today. So the first is a letter of Clement. Now, Clement was a disciple of Paul in Rome. Many people think that this is a Clement that is mentioned in Philippians chapter 4, but we're not sure. All right, so in the year 96, he wrote a letter to the church at Corinth. That's why some people call this Corinthians 3, because it's another epistle to the Corinthians. It was full of encouragement and admonitions, just like Paul's letters. So he's sort of echoing what Paul was doing. The purpose of this letter was to reestablish the authority of the elders and deacons in Corinth. So these elders and deacons had been disbanded by the members of the church, and Clement felt that there was something wrong with what they had done, so he was trying to give them instruction on that. It was a bid for church unity, and he emphasized good order and discipline in the church. All right, so he's re-emphasizing that. It's important to take note of that because you'll see a theme here. That's what a lot of the second century writings are about. They're about church order. Next, the letters of Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius was the bishop of Antioch. He's arrested by the Roman authorities, and they put him on a forced march to Rome. During this time of traveling to Rome, he writes 7 letters to the churches of Asia Minor and Rome. And in these letters, he strongly urged for the unity in the churches and for the leadership of a single bishop for each church. So we'll look a little bit more at that later. Next, we have the Didache. Didache is a Greek word. It's Greek for teaching. So this is a really interesting document. It was written around 100 AD, and it's basically our oldest catechism. And what a catechism is, it's a book of teaching and instruction. It's usually verbal instruction. Some people call it, Nicholas Needham calls it a handbook for church discipline. So there's 2 parts of the book. Part 1 contained doctrinal teachings based on a way of life versus a way of death. Part 2 contained advice on church practices, and it covers a lot of different topics such as prayer, fasting, baptism, the Lord's Supper, church leadership, and how to handle visiting prophets. Interesting enough, like people want to look at the Didache and say, okay, well, what did to kind of settle some of the disputes we have today? They'll say, what did they think about baptism? But it's relatively, it's not very binding on what it says about these things. It just gives general advice. You know, one thing I know about the Didache is it recommends. It does seem to favor immersion in baptism, but it also recommends using living water, which you're like, what is living water? But it just means moving water like a stream or a river. It just recommends that. It's not binding. It's not saying that you have to do it this way. So there's some interesting things in the Didache. Most of these documents, you can just pick them up online. They're out there and read them. So if you're interested. Yes?
If you're going to go to the internet for these writings, you mentioned that Ignatius wrote 7, but there's an awful lot of forgeries and additions, but they said you have to look for the 7 authentic letters.
Okay, I didn't know that. Okay. John says that you have to be careful with searching these online because there can be forgeries, particularly Ignatius.
Especially with Ignatius, there's like 20 of them.
Okay, I did not know that. That's interesting. Lastly, the letter of Polycarp to the Philippians. We'll talk more about Polycarp later. He was the bishop of Smyrna. This letter was one of the best representations of Christian life at this time. And basically, Polycarp is giving moral exhortations to the church. He warns them from departing against apostolic doctrine. So we have an idea that there is a apostolic doctrine. We don't want to depart from it. And he warns against the heresy of Docetism. And we'll talk about Docetism a little bit later. I'll explain what that is. All right, so we'll look a little bit at a couple of notes on the character of the church. What was life like as a Christian in the 2nd century? That's really what this entire lesson is about, reconstructing that. Church organization, we find that in the 2nd century, there's a threefold ministry of bishops, presbyters, and deacons. There's different names for these. Presbyter, another name for presbyter is just elder. These come directly out of the New Testament. These come directly out of Titus and the different epistles. There's been much controversy over the meaning of the terms bishop and presbyter. Some people don't recognize the distinction between those. They think that they are synonymous. The reason why the office of bishop arose was because of church discipline. So we read about the bishop in Jerome's writing in the 4th century. And Jerome explains how the office of bishop came to be, and it was appointed initially in order to guard against schism in the church. All right. So I think that it's just a kind of a practical measure to centralize authority so that the church doesn't splinter off. It's important to understand that bishops were not seen as new apostles. Bishops could not write new scripture, proclaim new doctrines, or claim personal infallibility. A bishop's authority was to conduct worship services, oversee church discipline, appoint elders, baptize, and preside at the Lord's Supper. A bishop was both elected by the congregation and ordained by the laying of hands of other bishops. This practice of laying on of hands, in time it gave rise to the doctrine that we know as apostolic succession. This meant that apostolic succession meant that the apostles ordained the first bishops by the laying of hands, and that future ordination of bishops relied on a similar transmission of authority. Okay? But there was also another connotation of this apostolic succession. It also meant just to uphold the doctrines of the apostles as well. All right, so it was a way of keeping doctrinal purity, doctrinal orthodoxy. It is important to note that apostolic succession did not grant infallible authority. The reputation of a bishop relied on his preaching ability first and foremost, and he guarded the apostolic faith by way of preaching and teaching. All right. Now, moving on to church teaching. What was 2nd century church teaching like? It was not very broad, not very expansive. Teaching in the 2nd century was narrow and conservative. Usually it just consisted of reading the scriptures verbatim, all right? Not much further than that. Despite that, Christian teachers were able to identify two main heresies at this time. And you'll see that as heresies come up or false doctrines come up, a lot of the times this is a way in which the church moves theology forward because they have to respond to the heresies. First, we have Docetism, mentioned earlier in Polycarp's letter. It comes from the word dokeo, meaning to seem. This was a widespread heresy, and it deals with the person of Christ. It says that Christ was not truly a human being. Okay, so God didn't really come incarnate in the person of Christ. He only seemed to be of the flesh, but was purely a heavenly being. So it was derived from Greek philosophy, which claimed that physical matter corrupted the spirit. So this is something maybe that we can see stems from Platonism, maybe. The second heresy is Ebionism. It's known as Ebionism. It comes from the Hebrew word ebionim, which means the poor ones. Now, these were Jewish Christians who wanted to continue practicing traditional Old Testament religion. They did not regard Jesus as God, but they thought of him as a supreme prophet and the one man who perfectly obeyed God's law. So they're right there, but they didn't believe that he was God. And notably, they rejected the writings of Paul. All right, moving on to church worship. What did a second century church service look like? Most of what we know about their church worship comes from the writings of Justin Martyr, the theologian Justin Martyr. We'll talk a little bit more about him later as well. The most characteristic thing about church worship that Justin writes about is that it's a twofold worship service. There's two parts of it. The first part was called the service of the word, where we get singing, reading, and a sermon. And notably so, this was open to all baptized believers. And this was open to baptized believers, catechumens, and outsiders and proselytes as well. So anybody could come in. The second part was closed. The second part was open only to baptized believers. I hope I made that clear, sorry. And this consisted of prayers and what they called the Eucharist. Now, the Eucharist is simply a Greek term, means to give thanks. And this is the term that they use for the Lord's Supper or communion. And here I'm going to give you just a rundown of what a general worship service was like, the order of worship. First, the bishop gave an opening greeting. You can notice a lot of similarities about what Christians do today, but then there's some differences. The bishop gave an opening greeting, and the congregation responded. So there's a lot of call and response. Then a portion of the Old Testament was read out loud. And Needham notes that often Scripture was chanted in large assemblies. Not always, but sometimes people read Scripture together out loud. Next, they would sing a song or hymn. After that, a portion of the New Testament from Acts to Revelation was read. After that, they would sing some more. And then after that, a portion of the Gospels was read. So we have this order of Old Testament, the epistles, and then the Gospels. After that, we would get a sermon. And interestingly enough, the pastor would preach from a seated position, and the rest of the congregation would be standing. Next, this is where the service would change, and they would dismiss all but the baptized believers. So after the sermon. Next would follow corporate prayer. In corporate prayer, a leader would announce a topic of prayer. There would be silent prayers for a time where people would pray over this on their own, and then the leader would summarize the topic in a prayer. And this process would be repeated through different topics. Next would follow communion in this order. The bishop would greet the congregation, and then the congregation would greet one another. And this is also where we understand that there was this custom known as the Holy Kiss, or the Kiss of Peace that we read about. Usually this is just a salutation, and usually it was like a kiss on the cheek, and it was men to men and women to women. So there's no, they were very cordial about this custom. People might think this is kind of weird. It's not a custom that we practice today. But there's been churches that Rebecca and I have gone to where they're like, turn to your neighbor and shake your hand. Yeah, it's kind of like that. So, then we have offertory, so collecting of alms, and the bread and wine is collected by the deacons, Interesting enough, the individual congregants are expected to bring their own tributes of bread and wine to distribute. Next, we have what was called a dialogue. So this was often a written communication between the bishop and the congregation, and it was read out loud. And then we have the breaking of bread and distribution. Okay. Lastly, there would be a benediction. Usually it would be something like "Depart in peace," something like that. The whole service would have lasted for about 3 or more hours. Okay. A little note on singing. Singing was normally responsive, meaning that one person, a leader, would chant or sing, and then the congregation would return a response. At this time, most of the singing that was done was from the Psalter. It was the Psalms exclusively. There are a couple of very early hymns that we know of. Okay. Another important note is that Christians in the 2nd century did not have musical accompaniment. The church leadership considered that this was going against apostolic doctrine. I think some of it has to do with the fact that musical accompaniment was associated with pagan rites. All right, so they wanted to, yes, Dave. The language varied across the empire, but mostly it's going to be Greek and Latin. So most of the music is sung a cappella. All right, and like I said before, it was a common practice for the congregation to stand throughout the whole worship service. It's kind of funny how it's like backwards. Today our congregation sits and our pastor stands. It was backwards. Congregation stands, pastor sits. This was considered probably a respectful way to do it. And notably so, church pews, where the congregation sits, weren't introduced until the 14th century. So it's pretty late development. Yeah, the invention of the folding chair. That was amazing for the church. Yes.
So the congregation stood for 3 or 4 hours?
That's what we're led to believe, yes. Yeah. I'm sure there was
I'm talking kids, children.
Yeah. I'm sure there was some variations in practice throughout the empire. It was a big place. But we just have to go off the small number of sources that we have. And then also the idea that they're seeing this as a way to honor the elder. So a brief note about liturgies. We do see evidence of liturgies being written. These are fixed written prayers and exhortations to be read out loud by the bishop to the congregation. The first known liturgy was written by Hippolytus, who was a presbyter in Rome. All right, so we do see some evidence of that early on. Just two things to note that I have here. Peculiar features of common church worship. One is known as what was called the Quarto-Deciman controversy. Basically what you want to know is that this was a disagreement between the church in the East and the church in the West. And they disagreed over what day Easter should be celebrated on. The details of this are not really important for this class, but I just wanted to add this because there's 2 takeaways that you can get from this. The Christian calendar revolved around the day of Easter. All right, so this shows their importance and reverence for the day of Easter. And the controversy would not be resolved until the ecumenical council at Nicaea in the 4th century. All right. The second peculiarity is what was known as the Agape feast, which is really interesting. This was a common church custom. Agape is the word for the love of God. And Christian writers such as Tertullian wrote very fondly about this social gathering. Most notably so, Tertullian contrasted the agape feast with pagan feast celebrations. He says that Christians practiced temperance and moderation. He says that their speech was honoring to God, and they sang special music. Whereas pagan feasts, on the other hand, he wrote, were occasions of excess and debauchery. So this was another way that they could show themselves to stand out from the pagan world around them. The agape feast also served a social function of benefiting the needy. So if you're hungry and needy, you could come and get something to eat. All right? Looks like I got a few more minutes left I want to get through this slide. Just a couple of notes on church and society. In the Roman Empire and beyond, Christian social values and morals brought the church into direct conflict and confrontation with pagan society. This was because pagan religion was present and integrated throughout the empire's social practices and institutions. There's a couple important things to note about this. Christians would abstain from state holidays. They were known to abstain from state holidays, there were many of them. There was a lot of state holidays and festivals. They would abstain from public entertainment. So these are things like in amphitheaters, things like that. And the Colosseum, different arenas. Christians also resisted hospitals, interestingly enough, because they were employed by priests of the god Asclepius. They also resisted schooling. They didn't really have a public school system like we have today, but there was a common curriculum, the Enkyklaios Paideia. They resisted schools, they resisted political movements, and military service. They also opposed abortion and easy divorce, which was something that singled them out. Notably, Christians often debated whether it was morally right to serve in the military, but it's important to note that the Roman military in time was full of Christians. There was a lot of Christians who served in the army. All right, so I see that I'm out of time, and we'll continue with this lesson next time. Thank you for coming.